Introduction. In St. Petersburg, as in many other places in Russia, the labor movement is very old. It is connected with the founding of the first large factories and with more or less drastic changes in the life and position of workers. The history of the Russian factory and the position of the working class in Russia gives a considerable number of very striking and sometimes striking examples of workers' aspirations to improve their position in self-liberation, aspirations that began to manifest not only long before the advent of the newest socialist theories, but long before the abolition of serfdom in Russia. What can be said about the first attempts to organize workers with the aim of jointly realizing these aspirations with joint forces? A significant number of relevant indications can be found, as in the old but beautiful work of Nd Bogdanov's Russian Factory in the Past and Present, Volume 1, ed. 1st, p. 1898, and in the new work of K. A. Pazitnov The Situation of the Working Class in Russia, Volume I, Petrograd, 1923. The example of the labor movement in the organization of the so-called post-session workers assigned to the stationery in Krasnoye Selo near St. Petersburg is especially interesting, instructive, and, one might say, amazing in this respect. This factory was originally state-owned. At the end of the XVW century, it was transferred to private hands and passed from one owner to another, with which the workers constantly clashed with the owners. At the beginning of the last century, the Krasnoselskaya paper station belonged to a certain Klednikov, who in 1803, in order to avoid further clashes with the workers, concluded a highly interesting agreement with them. According to this agreement, production passed into the hands of the workers themselves, controlled by their own electives. Workers received in their favor a fifth of the cost of all the paper produced and pledged for it to make the necessary repairs of factory buildings and machines, with the exception of nobles and change machines. The owner of the factory was obliged to regularly deliver rags, and the workers had to make a certain amount of paper of a certain quality from this rag. The whole course of work at the factory was supervised by a master elected by the workers. The working hours were set at the factory by the workers themselves, and it did not exceed 10 hours. The distribution between the workers of the amount attributable to them was made by their elective. In a word, according to this agreement, the Krasnoselskaya paper station had the character of productive workers' cooperation, which existed on the basis of an agreement of 200 organized workers with the owner of the factory. With the transfer of the factory from Khlebnikov to the new owner, to the landowner PETERSBURG, who was striving to destroy the concluded agreement, working unrest began due to non-fulfillment of the agreement by the new owner. Workers insisted on the execution of the contract, prisoner with Khlebnikov. PETERSBURG complained to the Minister of the Interior that the artisans fell away from all obedience, formed among themselves the society that governs them, rejecting all bosses over themselves. The government investigation into the case ended with some restriction on workers' self-government. This led to further unrest among workers who filed complaints with the sovereign himself, complaining of unjust deductions and asking for the factory to be accepted into the treasury and for granting them a loan of 100,000 rubles so that they themselves could manage the factory and would pay the treasury 15 kopecks from each stack of paper worked out. The government investigation into the case ended with some restriction on the workers' self-government. This led to further unrest among the workers, who complained to the sovereign himself, complaining of unfair deductions and asking for the acceptance of the factory into the treasury and for the issue of 100,000 rubles to them for a loan, so that they themselves would manage the factory and pay 15 kopecks to the treasury. From each stack of paper, the government investigation into the case ended with some restriction on the workers' self-government. This led to further unrest among the workers, who complained to the sovereign himself, complaining of unfair deductions and asking for the acceptance of the factory into the treasury and for the issue of 100,000 rubles to them for a loan, so that they themselves would manage the factory and pay 15 kopecks to the treasury. From each stack of paper. Nd Bogdanov's Russian Factory, p. 138. A new government investigation of the case, ordered by Emperor Alexander I, led to the fact that the owner of the factory had to return the workers the unpaid amount. But at the request of the workers to take the factory to the treasury and to provide it to them in their own management, the government refused. The dream of the Russian workers about the organization of a factory on the basis of labor cooperation, even before the emergence of the corresponding ideas in Western Europe, was not destined to materialize. But the very existence of such dreams among Russian working days of serfdom is very interesting and instructive. The example of the Krasnoselskaya paper factory is striking and may seem exceptional. However, in reality this is not an exceptional example of the organization and self-government of Russian workers of that time. Bodies of workers' self-government existed during serfdom and in other Russian factories, as evidenced by the regulations approved by the government concerning various factories, which were usually the result of clashes between workers and owners, that is, the result of the labor movement of that time. This labor movement already in the 30s of the last century began to seem very dangerous to the government from a political point of view and led to the publication of the harsh laws on strikes that appeared during the reign of Nicholas I in the Code of Russian Laws. In the Penal Code, the development of the labor movement abroad in the first half of the last century alarmed the Russian government, which began to fear a further increase in the number of factories and an increase in the number of workers. True, with the news of the uprising of the lion weavers in France and the start of the Chartist movement of the English workers, the Russian Minister of Finance, Count Takhtarev, in his most endorsed note to Emperor Nicholas, filed in November 1834, spoke very reassuringly about this. Referring to the difference between the Russian workers, who in most cases have not yet broken ties with the land, from the Western European urban proletariat, Count Takhtarev argued that the multiplication of the number of factories in Russia does not represent the danger that it has in the West, where it has long been there is a strong discontent of workers, prone to open indignation, and where the working class is a dangerous whole, and the factory owners exert a political influence on the workers, drawing them into the political struggle. In Russia, according to Takhtarev, the owners are tied to the existing order everywhere, and the workers do not constitute a dangerous whole, and therefore the multiplication of our factories is much more profitable and safer than in other states. But the rapid development of the Chartist labor movement in England, which shocked England 3 times during formidable industrial crises, and in particular the events of 1848, the revolution in a number of West European states and the wide participation of workers in revolutionary events, show the groundlessness of Count Taktarev's soothing optimism. The events of 1848 alarmed the Russian government much more than the Lion uprising and the Chartist movement of 1834, and made him fear the development of the proletariat in Russia. At that time, the Moscow governor Zakrevsky, in his most comprehensive note to Emperor Nikolai, wrote about the need to prohibit the opening of new factories and plants in Russia and, if possible, reduce the production of existing ones, without allowing an increase in the number of workers. This thought, however ridiculous, nevertheless testified to that the autocratic Russian government very early and quite correctly understood what significance the development of the proletariat and the labor movement in Russia could have for its further existence. Unfortunately, the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia understood this very much late, initially placing all his hopes in the struggle against the existing system on the peasants. G.V. Plekhanov, saying at one time that the Russian revolutionary movement would triumph as a labor movement or not triumph at all, as you know, turned out to be a prophet, but a prophet still very belated. What Plekhanov understood at the end of the 70s, much earlier understood, or at least felt, the Tsarist government. It is interesting to note here that the first Russian founder of the socialist theory of workers, N.G. Chernyshevsky, but the Narodniks did not recognize the independent significance of the labor movement and looked at their ties with the workers rather as a means of acquiring ties with the peasant milieu with which the workers were connected. Many of the propagandized workers, following the example of Pyotr Alexeyev, went to the people, leaving the city to the village, as did the urban intellectuals who had become Narodnik revolutionaries, members of the Earth and Freedom Society. And, it seems, only won laurels, that is, followers of P.L. Lavrov, who was the first in his revolutionary journal Forward to introduce the Russian intelligentsia to the German social democratic movement, insisted on the independent significance of socialist propaganda among urban workers. But the Lavrists did not have any strong influence even among the revolutionary intelligentsia. However, the populist movement of the Russian intelligentsia was not in vain for the workers. Its participants, who survived from pogroms, prisons, and exiles, returned to the cities and again began to propaganda among students and workers, setting a new goal: the fight against the Tsarist government, which impeded the success of the populist movement and sought to suppress it by all means. Thanks to the propaganda of the early and mid-70s, a number of revolutionaries had already accumulated among the workers of the largest urban industrial centers, who seemed ready to devote all their energies to the working cause from which the revolutionary intelligentsia of that time, which had begun a duel with the Tsarist government through revolutionary terror, which was a response to government persecution of the revolutionary populists. One cannot stop here on the participation of workers in the revolutionary movement of the 70s. This question is very thoroughly and clearly explained by G.V. Plekhanov in his famous and highly interesting memoirs. See G.V. Plekhanov, Russian Worker in the Revolutionary Movement. It is enough to mention the participation of St. Petersburg workers in 1876 on the political demonstrations at the Kazan Cathedral, during which for the first time in Russia the revolutionary red banner of earth and freedom in the socialist proletariat was unfolded. It is enough to recall that during this demonstration the workers formed the main core of the demonstrators who closed around G.V. Plekhanov, who made the speech. The workers also helped to repel the police, who attacked the crowd. A similar revolutionary significance was also given to a working demonstration, what happened a year later at the funeral of workers who died during the explosion at the Vasily Ostrovsky cartridge plant. The revolutionary-minded workers turned the funeral into a kind of anti-government demonstration. But in the everyday labor movement, the participation of revolutionaries was weak. The strike movement, which took place in St. Petersburg in the late 70s, arose independently, without any extraneous suggestions, although it was supported by rebels and studying youth who organized fundraising to help strikers. Strikes of 1878 at the new paper mill, at the Koenig factory behind the Narva outpost, at the Becker piano factory, at the Shapshal tobacco factory, they were only the beginning of the strike movement, which continued the following year, 1879, spreading to other factories. This labor movement had a purely economic nature of the struggle for everyday demands, for improving working conditions. The workers themselves led their struggle, turning for help to their brother, the worker, to workers in non-striking factories. This strike movement of the St. Petersburg workers exerted its influence on the activities of the members of the Revolutionary Society Earth and Freedom, especially those who had connections with the workers. During this time, the revolutionary significance of urban workers grew very much in the eyes of the revolutionaries, despite their populist tendency. The labor movement began to acquire an independent significance, which manifested itself most vividly at the time of the founding of the Northern Russian Labor Union in the late 70s. The North Russian Workers' Union, according to G.V. Plekhanov, arose from the St. Petersburg organization of the old experienced revolutionary workers, and from the first days of its foundation there were at least 200 members, mainly factory workers. He united the working circles that existed in various parts of St. Petersburg. These circles, they were, as it were, local branches of the Union, which were under the leadership, a central circle at the disposal of which was the central box office of the Union, supplemented by contributions from local circles, and a Union library. The chief executive officer of the Union, as you know, was Stepan Kalturin, who strove to create a print organ that could properly serve the work of the Union. An attempt to found a working newspaper, however, failed. The secret printing house in which her first number was being dialed was seized by the police. And the participation of Kalturin in the terrorist activities of the People's Will Party, which arose at the time due to the split of the Revolutionary Society Earth and Freedom, to a certain extent deprived the Union of its main leading force. Terrorist struggle of people's will with the Tsarist government attracted the most important forces of the then revolutionaries, not only intellectuals, but also workers. The example of Kalturin in this case was not an exceptional case and was very significant. The landlords, who remained faithful to their former populist program, turned into black settlers. Some of them subsequently evolved towards social democracy, following G.V. Plekhanov. But at the time described, they had no influence, especially in St. Petersburg, where the Narodnaya Volya heroic duel took place with the Tsarist government, which ended in regicide, the events of March 1, 1881, and the death of the main leaders of the Narodnaya Volya party, which had become exhausted in the struggle, which disastrously responded to the further existence of the Northern Russian Labor Union. It disappeared, true. The revolutionary activity among the Petersburg workers did not stop even after the fall of the People's Will Party. Even in the worst years of the 80s as reaction, there continued to be working circles organized around some workers who took part in the revolutionary movement of the period Earth and Freedom and People's Will. The mass labor movement, which temporarily subsided in St. Petersburg, made itself felt in other places. It manifested itself most vividly in 1884, during a strike at Morozov's large factory in Orkhovtsev. The leaders of the Morozov workers during the strike were the socialist workers Moiseyenko and Volkov, who helped the workers formulate and together defend their demands. This strike was of great importance and attracted the attention of both the government and various social circles. The government launched all means to suppress the movement. A mass of workers was arrested. A court was appointed over the most prominent participants in the strike, which, however, due to the sympathetic attitude of the jury, issued a verdict of not guilty to the accused. The reactionary journalist Takhtarev called this acquittal the first salute to the Russian labor movement. Justified by a jury, the workers were further persecuted by the government. After being released from court, they were arrested by the gendarme authorities and expelled. However, the strike of the Untitled workers and their trial was not in vain. Thanks to the abuses of the factory administration revealed in court, the government was forced to admit the fairness of the workers' demands and publish in 1886 special fines laws. However, the strike of the Untitled workers and the trial of them were not in vain. Thanks to the abuses of the factory administration revealed in court, the government was forced to recognize the justice of the demands of the workers and to enact special fines laws in 1886. However, the strike of the Untitled workers and the trial of them were not in vain. Thanks to the abuses of the factory administration revealed in court, the government was forced to recognize the justice of the demands of the workers and to enact special fines laws in 1886. The revolutionary socialist movement at that time was experiencing its turning point, outliving the old directions, along with which new, more relevant to the Russian reality and the urgent needs of the time, the needs of the labor movement in particular. In 1883, the former members of Earth and Freedom, G.V. Plekhanov, V.A. Zasulik, P.I. Axelrod, L.G. Deutsch and V. Ignatov, the black settlers who became Social Democrats, were founded the Social Democratic Labor Liberation Group, and a year later we see the emergence of the first Social Democratic group in St. Petersburg itself. I am referring to Blagoev's group, which published the first issue of the Social Democratic newspaper Rabuki in January 1885, and the second issue in July of that year, among which there were articles by Plekhanov and Axelrod. At that time, the populist trend still prevailed in the minds of the revolutionary intelligentsia, and despite the deep crisis of revolutionary concepts, the social democratic ideas of the emancipation of labor group met with great distrust and even hostility. But among the workers, a strong desire for education and for a better understanding of the surrounding reality was already manifested. Among the workers were those who managed to get some education and tried to help their comrades in their quest for light. The Memoirs of Nd Bogdanov, K.M. Norinsky and V.A. Shelginov testify to this quite convincingly and eloquently. In 1889, the idea arose to unite the working circles in various districts of Petersburg. This was the time of clandestine worker circles that existed for the purpose of self-education and propaganda. Many well-trained propaganda workers came out of these workers' circles, ready to devote their energies to the work of the workers and to prove themselves in it. Printed in the journal Emancipation of Labor in 1918, number 2, 4, 7. See the collection from Blagoev's group to the Union of Struggle, 1886, 1894, articles and memoirs of K.M. Norinsky, V.A. Shelginov, V. Nevsky, and Melnikov. Materials on the case of M.I. Brusnev and U. Melnikov. The Speeches of the Workers on May 1, 1891. Edition Dawn Branch of the State Publishing House. 1921. One of the first attempts of this kind was made in 1890 during a strike in the port of St. Petersburg, and a corresponding appeal was issued. The arrests inflicted sometimes on the circle workers were very serious losses, but the circle activities continued. Others took the place of those arrested. The work of the circle had the advantage of constantly giving new figures in return for those who were leaving, and thus contributed to even a certain accumulation of forces. In 1891, the circle workers showed themselves by presenting the address to the sick writer Shelginov, who paid a lot of attention to the working issue in his journalistic articles. A little later, during his funeral, there was a demonstration in which the circle workers took an active part. Finally, in the same year, 1891, the group workers showed themselves by celebrating May 1, arranging for this purpose a meeting of workers in the forest beyond the Neva outpost and making corresponding speeches. True, this meeting was secretly necessary, and a relatively small number, about 200, of organized workers were present at it. But it has gained great importance. The news of him and the speeches of the workers delivered on him spread widely, penetrated the provinces, testifying to the emergence of the socialist labor movement and awakening the brightest hopes everywhere, especially among working youth. National disasters, barren 1891 to 1892, followed by famine and cholera epidemic, all this led to a wide social movement that swept all over Russia. This movement embraced all layers of Russian society, from the starving peasants to the ruling classes. It manifested itself especially vividly in the activity of Zemstvo students who were young, especially revolutionary-minded and selflessly going to the aid of starving peasants. the public reaction of the 80s ended. The rise and resumption of the revolutionary movement began. The beginning of my recollections concerning the Petersburg labor movement of the 90s dates back to this time. However, I want to start the presentation from an earlier time, in order to give the reader the opportunity to more critically relate to the personality of the author, the inevitable subjectivity of which always introduces certain shades into his presentation, which, without any desire of the author, can influence the reader in an undesirable direction. In this short essay, I don't want to influence the reader in any direction. I just want to talk about what I was an eyewitness.